Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Neena Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host Neena Mishra. My guest today is Brad Loncar, CEO of Loncar Investments. Brad is a biotech expert. He created the indexes for the Cancer Immunotherapy ETF, ticker symbol Cancer, CNCR, and the China BioPharma ETF, ticker symbol CHNA. Brad, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
So 2020 was the most challenging year in decades. But it was a great year for scientific innovation and collaboration, particularly in the biotech space. Scientists were able to develop safe and effective vaccines for the coronavirus in record time. Now, two of those vaccines developed by Moderna and Biotech in partnership with Pfizer. These are very, very effective vaccines, and they use a new technique called mRNA or messenger RNA. So I wanted to start with mRNA technology. Tell us what exactly is mRNA and how are these mRNA vaccines different from old-fashioned vaccines?
Yeah, of course. So, you're exactly right. It's amazing. Biotech has been literally on the front pages of newspapers and news every day for the last year. And it's been a tragic and sad year, but it has been amazing to see how the general public has learned about these things. As a biotech investor, we know that there's so many cool game-changing technologies out there like mRNA, and you don't necessarily see them like you do in the tech sector. But this last year, especially for this, everyone has. And so I think it's really amazing how science has come to the forefront. So messenger RNA vaccines, these are the first ones that have ever succeeded. This is a new technology that's been in the work actually for decades, but there are no therapies or vaccines using mRNA on the market until these came along. And basically how these work, you have to not to get too nerdy, but you have to think of fundamentally how science and biology works. So, your body's made up of cells, and I think everyone's seen that you have a nucleus in your cell, and that's where your DNA is, and it's in there for a good reason. The nucleus is meant to be like a fortress. It's like an impervious wall around your DNA to protect your DNA. And cells are essentially big protein factories. Like your body is all made up of proteins. Your bones are made of proteins, your organs are made of proteins, your blood is made of proteins, and it's your cells that are making those proteins. And your DNA is the instructions for which proteins to make. And how it normally works, the DNA never leaves that nucleus fortress in your cell. There's another, a cousin of DNA called messenger RNA that reads the DNA in the nucleus and sees what protein that the cell should make. And then the messenger RNA takes that message, that's why they call it messenger RNA, and it leaves the nucleus, and then it tells the manufacturing part of your cell, essentially, which proteins to make. And so the idea behind mRNA companies all along has been, well, if messenger RNA tells your cells which proteins to make based off of the DNA instructions, why can't we just synthetically make messenger RNA and tell cells to make any proteins that we want? And so that's the idea behind it. So let's now talk about coronavirus. So you've probably seen pictures on TV and in the news of the coronavirus, and sometimes it's represented as like a ball with red things all over it. Those red things are called the spike protein, and that's the part that actually latches onto your cell and allows the coronavirus to infect you. And so what the mRNA companies have done, the other vaccine companies have also used this approach, is they said, well, if we can instruct your body to make basically a copy of that red spike protein, then your immune system would learn from that. And when the actual coronavirus, infects you one day or comes in contact with your bloodstream, then your immune system will have already been primed to know that red spike protein is a bad thing, and then to attack the coronavirus. And so that's exactly how those vaccine work. They're basically they use synthetic messenger RNA to instruct your cells to make that red spike protein. Your immune system learns from that, so that when you come in contact with the real thing in the future, or if you come in contact with the real thing in the future, your immune system will already know in advance that it's a bad thing and that it should attack it. And that's what it is. And really, I think really one of the revolutionary things about it is you've heard, when like this time last year before we had vaccines, you heard some scary stories that, it takes 3 or 4 years to make a vaccine. And in the past, that's been true. And one thing that messenger RNA really changed about that is as soon as China uploaded the RNA sequence of coronavirus to the internet, because mRNA vaccines are based off of what we call synthetic biology, these companies, Moderna and BioNTech, were very quickly able to take that basically recipe for that red spike protein and turn it into a vaccine. The Moderna and Dr. Fauci's group were able to inject the first test subject with that vaccine just a little over a month after receiving those instructions, which is truly amazing. So here we are a year later with 2 really amazing, efficacious vaccines, and it's all due to this, revolutionary technology.
Amazing and very, very interesting. So could you talk a little bit about advantages and disadvantages of mRNA versus the traditional vaccines? And one issue which we have seen in some cases, though I would add very rare cases of AstraZeneca and Johnson & Johnson vaccine is those blood clotting issues. And we have not seen those issues in Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna vaccines. So talk to us a little bit about advantages and disadvantages, though I should add that all this is still very, very new.
Yeah, and in fact, the Johnson & Johnson, the blood clotting issue, and AstraZeneca as well, it's not fully understood, the biology of why that's happening. I can talk about the top guess that people have right now, but it hasn't been proven. So the leading reason why we think it's not happening to mRNA and is happening to those is those use a technology called they're what's called viral vector vaccines. So the way that they work is they take a virus. In this case, it's actually the cold virus. That gives you like the common cold. And they put the DNA for the spike protein in that cold virus. And then that virus infects you and drops DNA, not mRNA, but DNA inside your cells. And then your cells start making the spike protein based off of that. And the leading guess right now of why that blood clotting issue is happening is when you're injected with those viral vector vaccines, it's like billions of viruses. And the leading guess right now is that some of them, before they infect your cells and tell you to start making the spike protein, that they might be breaking up in the bloodstream, and that DNA might be attaching to platelets. DNA has a positive charge and platelets have a negative charge. And then your immune system would attack that DNA because it's foreign, and that may be interfering with those platelets, and you might be creating antibodies to that. So that's a really nerdy explanation, but that's what we think. And the reason why we think it's not happening with mRNA is mRNA, instead of using a virus to get the mRNA in your cells, basically wraps the mRNA in what's called a lipid nanoparticle, which is essentially like a big ball of fat. And mRNA is also much more delicate than DNA. And so if some of the mRNA was getting outside of that fat and breaking up into your bloodstream, it would be less likely to attach to platelets like the DNA is, which is a little stronger than mRNA. So the bottom line is they have two totally different technologies, but also two totally different delivery technologies. One uses the virus and one uses this lipid nanoparticle. And we think that that's probably the main reason why it's happening to Astra and Johnson & Johnson, which are both viral vector vaccines, and not BioNTech and Moderna, which are mRNA vaccines.
So this technology is relatively new, that it is being used in vaccines for the first time, but you mentioned that it has been in the works for the past few years. And I read that some scientists were actually looking at using this technology to cure cancer. And you created the index for the cancer immunotherapy ETF, and we have discussed that in previous episodes, that how harnessing the body's immune system is the best way to fight cancer. So could you talk about how this technology can be used to fight other diseases like cancer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And both Moderna and BioNTech have really, from the beginning, casted a wide net, because the central idea of what mRNA is, being able to program your body to make any protein that you want. That's theoretically very powerful. And so they're both aiming to use it for a wide variety of diseases. So you mentioned that, they really did, focus on cancer very heavily, and still are. They've gone after rare diseases and even cardiology and some other things. And now we've seen infectious diseases with vaccines. And, I think historically what happens in medicine when you have a new platform like this is, initially there's a lot of enthusiasm, and you hope that it'll work in a wide variety of diseases. And the right thing to do is cast a wide net, like they have been doing. And I think ultimately what they'll find years from now is that, it probably works really well in one or two things, and maybe not others for various reasons, one of which is delivery. It's really hard to get mRNA into, whatever part of the body you want it to go to. So I followed both of these companies, very closely, even when they were private. And what I would say is, so far, we haven't seen anything as exciting as the vaccines in other diseases. Now, it's very early, but even in cancer, which has been a primary focus of those companies, there really hasn't been any strong signals in the early studies yet that would suggest that it's going to play a big role or a role at all in cancer. And so I'm optimistic that they could get there, but they're a lot farther in cancer than they are in vaccines. One of the amazing things about coronavirus is, how this tragic event really, the urgency of it sped up their development of the vaccines. In a normal situation, if this had never happened, we might not know that these work for vaccines for years from now. And the same, may be true for cancer and other things in the future. And, from a stock market perspective, I would say you have to be really careful, because they're great companies, but they've really made it look easy, over the last year. And biology is difficult and humbling, and it's not going to be as easy in other areas of medicine like it's been in infectious diseases so far. And from a stock market perspective, I think success in a lot of other things actually is kind of baked into them right now, and so they've got very high expectations on their shoulders. So, I think they're brilliant scientists, and this is a powerful technology. So I think over the years, they will, that they can prove that there will be many more uses outside of vaccines. And by the way, coronavirus is just the first of hopefully many diseases. I mean, that's definitely been a proof of concept as far as vaccines go. So we may see a lot of vaccines come out of this. But what I would say is, I would be cautious. I would be cautious about, cancer and other areas because it's a little more difficult to get mRNA into the places in the body that you want to get it to. And so far, we have not seen strong signals that it's definitely working like we saw over the last year with vaccines.
Yeah, definitely. And then a very interesting area to watch. Now, another technology which has gained a lot of attention lately is CRISPR, and particularly after two women scientists, Emmanuelle Charpentier and Jennifer Doudna, they won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for this gene editing technology. So talk to us a little bit about what exactly is CRISPR.
Yeah, so I should say at the outset, from a scientific standpoint, I'm very bullish on CRISPR. CRISPR has already changed the world, but over the coming decade or two, it's really going to change the world. That being said, I'm very bearish from a stock market perspective. That I think there was actually a CRISPR bubble. A lot of money flowed into those stocks. When you see something on like 60 Minutes. Everybody's kind of heard this term CRISPR now. And I think the general public has kind of been given the impression that CRISPR is going to cure a bunch of diseases and that it's going to happen tomorrow morning. And that's not true. I mean, one thing that's always important to remember in biotech is, number one, drug development takes a long time. And number two, these are businesses. And so they have to harness CRISPR against diseases that make sense and that ultimately turn out to be commercially successful. And I think a lot of people that are throwing money at the term CRISPR don't appreciate maybe what a long road these companies have. So what CRISPR is, it's really simple. It's a gene editing tool. There's actually a handful of other gene editing approaches. Gene editing is not new, but CRISPR does appear to be the best. So the nerdy science explanation of what it is bacteria are always being attacked by viruses. And they, over evolution, nature created something in bacteria that's kind of like an immune system, where once they're infected with the viral DNA, for the first time, going forward, they have this thing, CRISPR, that allows them to recognize it and cut it out of their DNA. And when scientists learned that, they were able to repurpose it. Like the layman's term of like why CRISPR is so powerful is that it can find a section of DNA that you're looking for very easily and cut it. And so this is something that naturally bacteria had used, and scientists learned to use it. So that's kind of the layman's term of what it is. And companies are in the very early stages of trying to turn it into therapies. There are no CRISPR-based therapies on the market yet. The very first ones are in clinical trials right now. And so, we'll see how that goes. And we can talk more about what it's being used for and what that may mean.
Yeah, definitely a very, very exciting technology, very innovative. And thank you for explaining that why it makes sense to be very excited about the technology itself, but not so much about the stocks and businesses that are developing this technology. So talk to us about how this technology and other gene editing technologies can be used to battle viruses, maybe? Can they be used to battle the coronavirus or cure other genetic diseases?
Yeah, there are some uses for coronavirus, especially on the diagnostic side. There's kind of two main like CRISPR groups, and they both founded diagnostics companies that harness CRISPR to do rapid COVID detection, which has actually been really successful. But like from a stock market perspective, one reason I'm bearish on them is there's a handful of publicly traded CRISPR companies. Like the most famous ones are Editas, Intellia, and CRISPR Therapeutics. And one reason I'm kind of bearish on them is the technology is from a gene editing standpoint is amazing. But like if you look at their pipelines, like all of these companies are starting out by working on the same blood diseases. One of them is called beta thalassemia, and the other one is called sickle cell disease. And with those types of diseases, they're using CRISPR in a way that we call ex vivo, which means the actual gene editing happens outside the body. So like beta thalassemia, for example, the patient's hematopoietic stem cells are drawn, and they're engineered outside the body to the correct form, and then reintroduced into the patient. And that's a very that sounds like a simple thing, but it's very intense. So you have to take like a chemotherapy preconditioning beforehand called busulfan. That's the same type of chemotherapy that cancer patients receive, because that clears out your bone marrow and your immune system so that those new cells can re-engraft and start producing healthy cells. And busulfan, this is something like outside of biotech, people, I don't think anybody really knows anything about. And so this busulfan is very intense. Like it can cause like follow-on malignancies, infertility, a lot of different problems. And so to use something like a gene therapy in a disease like beta thalassemia or sickle cell, it's going to be reserved for the very most severe patients. And the other thing is there's questions about how big the market is going to be. And the other thing is these are going to be really, really expensive drugs, and we're not sure if payers are going to pay for them. And there was a big news event that happened last week that suggests they may not. So there's a company, Bluebird, that's a gene therapy company. It doesn't use CRISPR, but it basically does, the same thing for beta thalassemia. And theirs is already approved and on the market in Germany. And they are in the European Union. And a big news event happened last week where they announced for the last couple of years they've been negotiating with the German government about paying for this, now approved beta thalassemia gene therapy, and they couldn't reach a price. Bluebird wanted almost $2 million as the price, and the German government wanted to pay less than half of that. And so Bluebird essentially is pulling out and laying off a bunch of staff. So these CRISPR companies, which all have beta thalassemia in their pipelines, there's nothing unique about CRISPR that's going to convince the German government to pay for this. Their therapies are going to be very similar to Bluebird's, whether you use CRISPR or not. And we just learned that, if these companies are expecting like $2 million, payers, especially in Europe, aren't going to support this. So anyway, there's just a lot of quirky things that, like, if you're just throwing money at the word CRISPR, you might not realize that, their pipelines are all very similar. And there's questions about, even if they succeed from a medical standpoint, will these really be commercial therapies one day? That's what the next 3 or 4 years of these companies is going to look like. Eventually, they'll get into other things. And the thing that I would watch really closely that's I think really going to give us a sense of whether CRISPR is truly as revolutionary as people hope it will be is when these companies start doing the gene editing not outside of the body but actually inside of the body. And there's actually one of those companies, Editas, that's already been the first company to start what we call an in vivo, gene edited medicine trial. So it's for a rare disease called Leber congenital amaurosis, and the first data from that will be out later this year. And so that's going to be really revealing, not just for that particular disease, but whether editing genes inside the human body works or not, and if there's any side effects or things to worry about from that. Like, that'll be a big proof of concept that really shows, like, if CRISPR is going to be ready for prime time in humans or not, because all of the gene editing outside the body, the ex vivo, there's a handful of tools that may not be as great as CRISPR, but like can get the job done. And we've already seen that with Bluebird, getting its beta thalassemia gene therapy to the market.
Very interesting. And you follow this area very, very closely, and you also created and run 2 biotech indexes. So I was interested in your favorite stocks, which investors can use to profit from very important advancements in mRNA and CRISPR or gene editing, other gene editing technologies. Let's start with mRNA stocks first. And Moderna and BioNTech are the best known for the mRNA technology. Are there other stocks too, which investors can look at? Talk to us about these 2 and other mRNA stocks.
Yeah, so those 2 are definitely, in my opinion, like way ahead and, for lack of a better term, the best. Like they're in a category of their own. They're really the leaders in this. And there are a couple other stocks of less proven companies. So one of them is called Translate Bio. The ticker symbol for that one is TBIO. And another one is called Arcturus Therapeutics. The symbol for that one is ARCT. And both of those have not been as strong out of the gate as Moderna and BioNTech. The Arcturus one, they've been in the news because they're trying to develop their vaccine. Specifically, they've been working with the government in Singapore with some of the funding and the clinical trials on that. And I just think that their antibodies in the very early studies have not been very strong. And I would be skeptical that one will be competitive with Moderna and BioNTech as far as coronavirus goes. And then there's actually a new company that's a recent IPO that's a German company like BioNTech. It's called CureVac. CVAC is the symbol. And they have a coronavirus vaccine trial that should have some news pretty soon. And one of the interesting things about theirs is, everyone's heard about how Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna have to be shipped and stored at, ultra cold temperatures. CureVac is the first mRNA company that thinks that they have a solution to that and that theirs can be stored at like normal temperatures longer. And so they've got a study going on right now, and with that idea in mind, and that could be important, especially for distributing an mRNA vaccine in places of the world that don't really have that cold storage, logistics capabilities. And so we'll have to see how that one looks.
Right. Now let's talk about some of the CRISPR and other gene editing stocks. And you mentioned that you are bearish on some CRISPR stocks, and you also mentioned why. And investors have actually poured a lot of money in some of the CRISPR stocks. CRISPR Therapeutics is one of the best known CRISPR stock because of its name, and also because Dr. Charpentier is a co-founder. And Dr. Doudna also co-founded some CRISPR companies, including Caribou Biosciences and Intellia Therapeutics. She also helped co-found Editas, which she left later. So could you talk a little bit more about any other CRISPR stocks that are attractive in your view?
Yeah, so there's one I'd highlight. The valuation also makes me nervous, but there's an important thing. So another thing that like the average like non-biotech person probably doesn't know about CRISPR is that what we've been talking about so far, like when you hear that term CRISPR, it's like as powerful as that is, that's essentially version 1.0 of CRISPR technology. And there's already newer, hopefully better versions of it being developed. And the company that I would circle is Beam Therapeutics. BEAM is the symbol. And again, the valuation of this one actually makes me really nervous because, like the CRISPR, like the three you mentioned, tons of money has been thrown at this company. And, what I said I'm bearish about, all of them have the same disease, beta thalassemia and sickle cell is their main program. That's true with this one. And this one has never even been in a clinical trial in humans. It will probably later this year or this time next year. So it's very early, and this company already has a multi-billion-dollar valuation, which makes me a little uneasy. But the reason I like it is it uses a CRISPR type technology that's like a newer thing called base editing. And the important thing about that is when you edit with CRISPR, you get what's called a double-stranded break. So, when CRISPR cuts, essentially, like in layman's terms, it cuts, both of, you've heard of the double helix, which is how DNA is. Like it cuts both sides. And base editing, on the contrary, just changes individual letters. And so, like with CRISPR, one of the things you're naturally worried about is, will there be mutations? Is this going to cause cancer one day? Like if the cut and the piecing, the natural piecing back together, doesn't go, perfectly or something. Well, if you can avoid that double-stranded cut aspect of CRISPR and just, change individual letters, like is the idea behind base editing, then number one, that could be much more precise in theory, and number two, it also might be a lot safer. That's another thing I would mention, that like in biotech, you always have to like be an optimist and bet on science and bet on good science, but you also have to respect the things that could go wrong. And when you're editing a human's DNA, we talked at the very beginning of the show how nature over millions or billions of years has put that DNA in the nucleus for a good reason. Like it doesn't want anything to change it. And we're with these gene editing tools, we're doing that. And you have to respect that, like, it's possible that things can go wrong. And so I think that base editing is potentially a more precise and potentially safer way of doing CRISPR in the future. But, it's years behind the CRISPR company. So that's a story that's going to take a very long time to play out. I mean, Beam, if everything went perfectly, might have a drug on the market, 7 or 10 years from now. I mean, that's the type of time frame that we're talking about. And again, the thing that makes me nervous about CRISPR in general is I think the general public has just been kind of given the impression that CRISPR is going to like cure a lot of things and like make a lot of things happen, like, within like the next 2 or 3 years. And that's not true. The first therapy for sickle cell and beta thal may be in the market, in the coming, 2 or 3 years. But it's going to take a long time for things beyond that to be developed and eventually, make it to patients and hopefully the market one day.
That's very helpful. I agree. It's an area with massive potential, but there are a lot of things, as you mentioned, which could go wrong. Now, I wanted to talk about your China ETF. It is the Loncar China BioPharma ETF, ticker symbol CHNA. And I noticed that it is the top performing China ETF this year, and it is also the top performing healthcare-based ETF. It has gained almost 30% in 2021. So talk to us about this ETF, what it holds, and the reasons behind its excellent performance this year.
Yeah, thank you. I love this story. I've been focused on this for the last 3 or 4 years, and I'm just very bullish on this whole concept. So there's a biotech boom happening in China today. And essentially, if you went back 2 or 3 years ago, China didn't have a biotech sector. And we're in the very early stages of them having one. China's trying to change its economy from being a manufacturing-based economy like we think of it to higher value areas like science and technology. And they've circled biotech because, as we've seen with coronavirus, like this is integral to society, and, like this, biology is going to have a big role to play over the coming decades. And so China essentially a few years ago said, we want to be a global leader in biotech, and they were starting from essentially nothing. And we're in the very early stages of that happening. So the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, up until a couple of years ago, if you were a biotech company, you couldn't even list on the stock exchange there because they had a rule that said you need a certain amount of profit and revenue to list on our stock exchange. And just like the government saw that biotech was the future, the stock exchange saw the same thing. And they said, if we're going to be a globally competitive stock exchange, we have to be a leader in biotech. And so they changed that rule just for biotech companies, because most biotech companies don't have profit and revenue. They're, they're what we call development stage companies. And since that happened, it's really that and a handful of other things have sparked a true biotech boom in China. So, a couple dozen companies have already listed on the exchange based off of that rule. And, with the government's backing, essentially, a lot of biotech companies have been incubated and are in the, the very early stages of trying to be leaders. And so the way I explain it to people is, from an investment standpoint is, if you could go back in time and invest in the U.S. biotech sector when it was brand new, when Celgene and Amgen and, these companies that are world famous today were small IPOs that, most people had never heard of, would you do that? And that's exactly how I feel the opportunity is, in my opinion, for China biotech. Like, I believe there will be, a Chinese Amgen, a Chinese Celgene, and so on. And we're in the very early stages of that. And so the performance that you mentioned has just been really reflective of that. Kind of the first generation of biotech drugs that have resulted from this boom are starting to make it to the market. And I think the world is seeing that, Chinese companies are conducting, really, first-rate science. We've seen that through the vaccine race. There's a handful of Chinese vaccines on the market for coronavirus. That's something you would have never seen, 5 or 10 years ago. And it's kind of emblematic of just this whole idea. And so Chinese companies are doing good science, and that's being recognized, and you have this kind of biotech stock market boom because companies can list there for the first time, and it's been a growth area, and another thing I'd say, we in the U.S. we've seen the transition to this new administration, and you're starting to see like government factors impact the performance of the U.S. biotech sector. So, the capital gains tax rate has been in the news. That's put a chill on a lot of growth stocks. That's affected U.S. biotech. There's new drug pricing legislation that's been submitted to Congress. The FTC has said they want to start scrutinizing pharmaceutical mergers and acquisitions more closely. So you have like a lot of like macro factors that are kind of holding back the U.S. biotech sector over the last few months. So that kind of explains why it's doing so well. This theme of China biotech is doing so well, compared to just healthcare more broadly. And the reason why it's doing so well compared to China investing is, this is an industry of the future. And actually, China's tech sector has had a really rough 3 or 4 months. The Alibaba story with Jack Ma when its subsidiary Ant tried to go public, raised a lot of government ire. And now a lot of their leading tech companies are kind of, being very closely scrutinized, and the government is really in many ways pushing back on that sector. And when people think of like, China investing over the last 5 or 6 years, it's been all tech. I mean, there was a tech boom, and that's been held back a little bit, at least over the last 3 or 4 months. And I think everyone through coronavirus has seen how important healthcare is to the future, and China's, no different. And so, just like there was a tech boom in China over the last decade, I think there's going to be a biotech boom there over the future decade. And I think, that's really being reflected in the performance right now.
Makes a lot of sense. And I'm looking at the top holdings: Kintor Pharmaceutical, CanSino Biologics, CSPC Pharmaceuticals, Sino Biopharmaceutical, and I'll admit that I know nothing about any of these companies. So could you talk a little bit about some of the top holdings and why you like them?
Yeah, so most of the holdings are Hong Kong listed, and I know that not everyone has access to Hong Kong stocks, but there are a handful of NASDAQ ones. And there's one of those that I'd really circle that I think is an interesting company. So there's a company called IMAB BioPharma, and the NASDAQ symbol for that one is IMAB. And the reason I like that one is they're conducting great science. So for example, in cancer, one of the promising cancer targets right now is something called CD47. I won't go into what that is, but that's something that there's a lot of eyes on. And they're developing a CD47 drug for cancer. And AbbVie, the big, multinational, biotech company, licensed this company IMAB's CD47 drug, and is going to help them develop it and, hopefully commercialize it one day outside of China. And so I think that's really, an amazing thing that, when I think of this concept, I usually think of Chinese companies licensing Western drugs, for development and sale in China. This is the opposite direction. A company as sophisticated and as, good at R&D as AbbVie is licensing this Chinese company's science in this particular case. And I think it's really a reflection on the quality of science that they're doing there. And a reason I really like them is not only is that, a promising drug, but it's a very diversified company. They're working on all kinds of things. They have something called a CD38 drug and growth hormone and all kinds of different things. So this is one of those companies, as I said, like I think there's going to be a Chinese Celgene, a Chinese Amgen, a Chinese Genentech. I think a company like this has a chance to be a leader based off of the science in their pipeline. One of the Hong Kong's ones I would mention, since we talked so much about Biotech, is one of the larger companies there called Fosun Pharma. So the symbol for that is 2196. In Hong Kong, they use numbers for their symbols. And it's the company that, just like Pfizer, we call like the Beyond. We actually, a lot of people have never heard BioNTech. They just think of it as the Pfizer vaccine. Well, BioNTech is actually partnered with Fosun Pharma in China. So in China, they think of it as the Fosun vaccine. And that'll likely be approved in July, at least based off of headlines we're seeing in the news. And, the fact, BioNTech could have partnered with any Chinese company, like literally any one. And the fact that they chose Fosun, like they chose Pfizer here, is a sign of the scale and the professionalism of Fosun, and a sign that it's a leader. Another thing, you and I have talked about CAR T a lot in the past. You might remember the first ever CAR. In fact, I think you did an interview with the company. One of the first CAR T approvals was a company called Kite Pharma. So Kite partnered with Fosun for their CAR T in China as well, and that's actually in front of the regulators and might be the first ever CAR T approved in China. So they're at a lead. They're a leader in having some of the leading technologies and bringing those to China. So those are two that I would focus on. But I think biotech in general is very like stock picking is very risky. Like even good companies have major setbacks sometimes. And for this, because biotech itself is so new in China, it's especially risky. Like I want to be very clear. Like this field is going to be very volatile and risky, and there's going to be some major successes and some major fails. And I think this type of theme, even compared to others, I think especially taking like an index approach makes the most sense. Like it's really important to be diversified, and the idea here is this is I think a mega theme that's going to play out over a decade, and I'm a big fan of trying to spot huge themes like that and just playing the theme itself. It can be very, very risky playing individual stocks. So I just I want to make sure that as I mention these names, I put those those cautions out there for people who are listening.
Totally makes a lot of sense. All these areas have a lot of growth potential, but these stocks are going to be very, very volatile and very risky. So an ETF approach makes a lot of sense. That's all we have time for today. Brad, always enjoy chatting with you. Thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks for listening. And as Brad highlighted several times during the discussion, biotech has a lot of growth potential, but it is a very risky area because these companies are working on some very innovative, life-changing technologies, but a lot could go wrong. So ETFs are a much safer way of investing in biotech. And the two ETFs that use indexes created by Brad that we discussed today are CNCR and CHNA. And investors should also look at the broader biotechnology ETFs. IBB is the most popular. It's by iShares. It's the iShares Biotechnology ETF. This is a market cap weighted ETF. And XBI, which is by State Street, that's an equal weighted ETF, so that tilts away from the mega caps towards more small and micro cap, more innovative and growthier companies. So that is also worth a look. And I also wanted to summarize the stocks that we discussed today. Some of the stocks that we discussed today are Moderna, ticker symbol mRNA, BioNTech, ticker symbol BNTX, Translate Bio, ticker symbol TBIO, T-Bio, CureVac, ticker symbol CVAC, CVAC, and Beam Therapeutics, ticker symbol BEAM. If you like our show, please leave us a rating on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts, and also make sure to subscribe so that you do not miss any episode. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please email podcast@zacks.com.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.